Okay, so for the home audience, we were just talking. What we're going to do is we're going to cut the IRB assignment just because of how busy things have been this semester. We're going to kick that research design to the date that the IRB is currently due, which is the October the 23rd. So on October the 23rd, your research design, I'll give you guys a little bit longer to work on it. So that was the announcement that we just made. And now we're about to pick up where we left off, which is talking about intrusive, obstructive, right, research. Research is not on people.
I'm just going to turn that.
What? So, where do we leave off? What do you guys have in your notes?
The content analysis.
So we just started to talk about content analysis. What was content analysis?
The study of discourse, like what people are saying.
Yeah. So basically, content analysis studies discourse. And discourse, there's actually, and I'm going to use this word too. Sometimes you'll hear people in qualitative circles talk about discourse or text. And we actually mean this in a lot broader sense than most people mean the word. So if you want to take it like discourse is sort of like an overarching term. So like text is more specific. So whatever you're analyzing, right, is going to be referred to often as text. This could be photographs, this could be movies, this could be anything like that, right? This could be, what people actually say, right? In videos, it could be all kinds of things. It could be books, right? Text, broadly speaking, is anything that conveys meaning, right? Anything that conveys meaning can be read as a text. Right? Discourse refers to what's going on overall. So it's more macro, right? What's going on overall. And sometimes we'll even refer to it in the plural as just the discourse, right? Which gives us this feeling that society has a lot of communications. It's built up of a variety of communications, and that's the discourse. And the discourse is made up of text. Right? You guys kind of catch the language there? Does that make sense? So if you want to think about content analysis, is particularly interested in analyzing text. And it's going to be, so the kind of questions you're going to be interested in answering with discourse analysis are going to be questions of what's being said, who's saying it, to who are they saying it, when is it being said, where is it being said, for what purpose, to what effect, and often importantly, what is sort of like the hidden meaning behind it, right? So the book refers to the distinction between manifest and latent meaning. So discourse analysis sometimes is just an analysis on the surface of what's being said. So it's literally an analysis of what is the content of the words coming out, right? So this could be like, he gives the example when he shows coding where he goes through and he finds different uses of the word abomination in Leviticus, right? That would be a very like manifest way of looking at a text. What is literally the words being said? A lot of times I'd say predominantly what content analysis people do is they actually look for some sort of latent meaning, right? What's the implication of what's being said, right? In particular, often, what is the political implication? What's the political implications of what's being said? A lot of content analysis is particularly interested in power, right? So it's like you look for things like what are sort of latent class biases, what are latent racial biases, what are latent, right? All these sort of things inside of the things that people say in whatever text you're looking at, right? Make sense? So it's interested in power often. You see that in a variety of ways. Probably one of the more important versions of the search for latent meaning is ideological critique. And there's a lot of this in sociology in particular. You get this in criminology and critical circles of criminology, right? So usually what's going to happen here is they're going to be looking for things like, yeah, those hierarchies, race, class, gender. Feminist critiques would fall into this. We've kind of probably all seen like things like feminists talking about things like advertising in magazines or something. Has people seen this? This was a big body of work in like the 80s or 90s. The feminists would go through advertisements and find all the ways in which things like women are reduced to individual body parts. So a lot of advertisements won't show a woman's face, they'll just show an individual part of her body, right? And this is the discussion of like, well, these objectify, right? They take the parts of the body without taking the whole person. Or there's other ways in which they'll find sort of latent sexual undertones to most advertising, which are sometimes not so latent, right? And all that would be an example of kind of like an ideological critique. What are the latent meanings, right? On the surface, it's just a beer ad. What's the latent meaning, right? The latent meaning is it objectifies women, it turns women into objects, it, you know, reinforces political differences and hierarchies between sexes, it encourages violence against women, right? All those kinds of things would be examples of ideological critique of latent meaning of text. Make sense? So that's usually what it is. The entire critical tradition, you know, the critical tradition probably makes up a quarter of the field of sociology. So like it's a big chunk of it. And a lot of that research is done in content analysis. Has anybody ever heard of in their classes, if you haven't taken theory yet, you'll hear of it for sure, the Frankfurt School of Sociology. Like the Frankfurt School does a lot of things like analyzing movies, right? And that's all kind of falls under this too. They'll analyze movies to find ways in which, right, certain ideas or political underpinnings sort of underlie what's being looked at. Okay, all that makes sense? So that's kind of content analysis. Content analysis is just going over, right, those. Sometimes they're sampled systematically, sometimes they're not. It really depends on the goals of the researchers. A lot of this stuff ends up being like, kind of more like, often than not, people find something that they think of as really interesting, and then they will find other things that work similarly and sort of display how it's working. Like I did a content analysis study not that long ago on music videos for a rap group called the Verb. They were a South African rap group. And you had a lot of these like, where people would essentially transition from being black into white constantly in their imagery. And like literally like they would just face paint completely black or completely white, and they would like switch constantly throughout the video. And so I kind of like analyzed what was the latent meaning being communicated by these sort of transformations across race, right? That would be an example of a very normal kind of content analysis study, right? Okay, any questions on that? Make sense? And once again, just like I said before, one of the advantages of this sort of work, you don't have to do an IRB, you're not working directly with people. The sort of ethical considerations are not as strong. You don't have to be as careful about what you say about public figures, things like that, right? Okay. Lastly, for this type of research that doesn't use human subjects, we should talk about comparative historical research. which is one of the older research traditions. So comparative historical research, this is where sociology kind of meets history. There's a couple other historical methods, but comparative historical research is one of those places. It's really, if you're trying to answer really, really macro questions, right? So if you're trying to understand things like, if you think back to like when you first took a sociology class, right? In particular, you would have like questions about like, how does modernity affect how people interact, right? These sort of huge questions. Those things are usually answered with this method. And that's because it allows you to talk about large segments of time and large segments of space. You know, so far what we've looked at is mostly studies that are very much so bound in space and time. The most bound is going to be qualitative, right? It's very small scale. But then also statistics is often bound to whatever population you're looking at, right? This allows us to ask bigger questions. The first sort of comparative historical figure in sociology is Max Weber. People heard of Max Weber? Max Weber was famously, and this we go into more detail on this in theory, but Max Weber wrote a book, The Protestant Ethic, and the Spirit of Capitalism. And a real brief explanation of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism is that Max Weber is trying to show the ways in which capitalism changed people's attitudes towards wealth and work. So Protestantism changed people's attitudes towards wealth and work that led to the rise of capitalism. It's a classic study in sociology. And in fact, if you were to talk about, when sociologists talk about classical theory, which is supposed to be the people who founded the field, Max Weber is one of the three big classical theorists. And this is partially because he invents the historical comparative methodology. Our textbook even cites him in that section as well. But he didn't just write this one book. Max Weber actually does a larger comparative study. So he does one study that's on like the rise of capitalism, which is written very much so like a history, right? And it's sort of like just comparing people's attitudes before and after Protestantism. But then he goes through and he does all these other counter studies of places where it seems like capitalism should have started, where people should have built their lives around accumulating wealth, but it didn't. So he does a book on ancient Judaism. He does a book on the religions of India. He does a book on the religions in China and how religion serves a very different function, right? It interacts with capitalism very differently in a way that suppresses it and keeps it from occurring, right? That's a good archetype of how comparative historical study works. You take a handful of disconnected examples of something, and then you look at how is it that they're different? How is it that they're similar? Right? So it takes that sort of comparative historical research, takes that sort of comparison aspect of something like statistics or something like an experiment, right? It's maybe not as rigid methodologically because it's more interested often in meanings and attitudes and things like that. But it allows you to definitely take that at a really macro level and see how is it that we can see changes across society and time. So another good example of this is a more recent one. There's a 2014 book I assigned for a sociology of religion class called Political Violence in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which was a comparative study of the long history of political violence in all three religions and seeing like what was the context of political violence for each, when does it happen, how does it happen, and how do we see differences on the basis of basically how is the beliefs driving different forms of political violence, right? It's another example, right? So you're taking political violence and you're comparing it across these different contexts. This is also super common in fields like political science does this a lot. What you're really interested in your topic on, do you mind sharing what your topic was? Because this is like archetype kind of. In fact, it reminds me of another study.
It's essentially an analysis of political extremism and wondering if there's predicting factors towards political extremism across the international community. So I'll be analyzing essentially movements across the world of different beliefs and how if there's like underlying predictors of those movements. So.
Yeah, and in your study as well, it's Brooke, right? Yeah, your study as well, right? Where you're interested in differences in people's attitudes towards animals, right? This is exactly the kind of method you would answer that with, right? You could do histories of each individual